Christianity drove the effort to ban alcohol, with liquor said to be the devil's brew and thought to be evil, ungodly, and impure. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, led the charge. Founded in 1874 in Cleveland, Ohio, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was made up of women of various ages who all wanted to ban intoxicating liquors in order to keep families safe. The argument had to do with protecting the home because they believed that people who drank were more likely to be violent to wives and neglect their children. The leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was Frances Willard, a Christian activist for suffrage and women's rights. The Women's Christian Temperance Union grew out of the Women's Crusade of the winter of 1873 to 1874. The WCTU held protests that demanded the sale of liquor stop. The WCTU was a major force in passing the 18th Amendment. Other organizations took part in influencing Congress to ban alcohol and urging people to quit drinking. One organization was the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League was founded in 1893 in Oberlin, Ohio, and began as a state organization. It was an organization that supported Prohibition and was against saloons. Saloons are places like bars where you could buy alcohol. The Anti-Saloon League grew more powerful and eventually became a national organization. They worked with churches and other temperance groups, especially the Women's Christian Temperance Union, to achieve national prohibition. The U.S. government decided to ratify the 18th Amendment to attempt to lower crime, improve health, and reduce social problems, such as drunk men at work and domestic violence. World War I was also a major factor in bringing about prohibition. American attitudes were opposed to all things German. They were our opponents in World War I. Makers of alcohol, such as the big brewers and distillers, were of German origin. Prohibition seemed like a patriotic thing to do during wartime.
The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect on January 16, 1920. It banned the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol. Oddly, the actual act of drinking alcohol was not outlawed by the 18th Amendment. The National Prohibition Act, which became the 18th Amendment, was a social experiment conducted by the U.S. government to see if they could have an alcohol-free nation. By the time the 18th Amendment was ratified, 65% of the United States had already banned alcohol through state laws. The National Prohibition Act was also known as the Volstead Act for Andrew J. Volstead, a congressman from Minnesota who sponsored the act. Legislation banning alcohol easily passed the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives in 1917. State legislators ratified it by January 1919, 2 months after the end of World War I. President Woodrow Wilson vetoed the bill, but the House of Representatives overrode his veto on the same day, October 28, 1999. And the Senate, 1 day later, 46 states ratified the 18th Amendment, far more than the required number. Only 2 states did not ratify the law, Connecticut and Rhode Island, and so the 18th Amendment became the law of the land. Despite Prohibition, the 1920s became the Roaring Twenties, a decade of lively and flashy young people, prosperity, excitement, and new inventions such as the radio. Jazz music and dancing became very popular. New entertainment forms like motion pictures gave the feeling that new discoveries were around every corner. The party atmosphere of the 1920s made many people want to drink alcohol, and the new law against it became very hard to enforce. Organized crime gangs developed, and average people could become lawbreakers for buying an alcoholic drink. Prohibition nearly destroyed the legal brewing industry. Without being able to sell their main product, the brewing industry was declined immensely. Some breweries in the industry survived by making and selling other products like corn syrup and malt extract. liquor ingredients, and some opened up malt and hop stores, beer ingredients. When Prohibition started,
Smugglers and gangsters also showed up during Prohibition. One of the most famous gangsters of the 1920s was Al Capone. Alphonse Capone controlled the sale of alcohol to 10,000 speakeasies in Chicago and sources of booze as far away as Canada and the Florida coast. No one knows how much money he made, but he made a lot of his money through bootlegging. Because beer had to be moved in big trucks, they had to bribe police and government officials. Violence broke out between rival gangs. Over 500 gang murders took place in Chicago. Few of the murderers faced any kind of justice, and Al Capone seemed above the law. Politicians and maybe even judges reportedly took orders from him over the phone. Later in his life, Al Capone was finally arrested and convicted for tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Unlike most gang leaders who were shot, he died of natural causes in 1947. America voted for Prohibition to reduce crime and protect the home, but Prohibition did just the opposite. It spawned organized crime, and people drank illegally. There were also loopholes in the 18th Amendment, such as obtaining alcohol using a physician's prescription to purchase liquor for medical reasons. 30 million gallons of alcohol was sold illegally for medical purposes in 1920.
The illegal consumption of alcohol occurred at places like speakeasies, which were illegal bars that served alcohol. They sometimes served things like soft drinks or milk, and customers dropped some alcohol in the drink from their own flask. Over 5,000 speakeasies existed in the United States in 1922, and by 1927 there were over 27,000. Bootlegging was another way of illegally obtaining alcohol by smuggling it from wet countries that allowed alcoholic beverages, like Canada, whose prohibition laws had already ended. Moonshiners were people who made their own liquor at home. Speakeasy owners, bootleggers, and moonshiners could make big profits selling alcohol illegally, which encouraged more people to become bootleggers, speakeasy owners, and most importantly, criminals.
Organizations to repeal the 18th Amendment formed just after the ratification of the law. As repeal organizations grew bigger, the groups supporting Prohibition declined in power. Repeal organizations were also aimed at protecting children. It was believed that having gang violence and lawbreakers around children would not be good for them. A famous repeal organization was the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, which was several times larger than the Women's Christian Temperance Union. WONPR was founded by Pauline Sabine, who wanted to prove that not all women were for Prohibition, which is what most of the nation believed at the time. When Democratic presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for election in 1932, he promised the repeal of Prohibition. People turned against the law and realized that Prohibition was not going to achieve the goal people were trying to achieve when they voted for it. The Great Depression was also a main factor. The economy needed tax dollars, and an alcohol tax could bring them in. A new bill was introduced that would repeal Prohibition, the 21st Amendment. Utah was the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment and end Prohibition. This was the first time in history that a constitutional amendment was repealed with another amendment in the United States. The Prohibition Act ended on December 5th, 1933, and with that, the social experiment failed, marking the end of much gang violence, bribery of government officials, and disrespect for the law.